to Madame Raven's. This way to the library. She's been expecting you.
The Lacy Brooks Pack. Neon Moon, Part 2. Well, get out a few blocks from the warehouse. It should be safe to trawl the city streets, considering our Overwatch party. Earl grinned around at his companions in the back of the truck. Val responded on the intercom. Got it. The GPS says we're almost to our parking space. The alleyway where we will unload reeks from garbage and waste. Most of you will enjoy it, I'm sure. But no time for sensory overload. We'll have to keep moving. Lots of people running around in the dark. A few have torches of varying types. More have weapons. They seem to be congregating between here and downtown, getting a few crazy looks. Once they've seen enough bodies, they might decide to take on a newer model large truck like this one. She laughed. Can't wait until they get to try to loot the cargo. She turned into the space she and Earl had selected before they picked up the rest of the pack. It was street parking next to an alley mouth. Several businesses that closed with the end of each workday lined the streets. The last of the roving individual pieces of feces had disappeared in the direction of the gathering crowd of turds, so the streets were quiet except for the rabble-babble that echoed back to them from among the buildings. All out for Cesspool City, last stop on the line, Earl announced as Val opened the rolling door at the rear of the vehicle. The entire pack, including the Squatches and the Skunk Ape auxiliaries, quickly lit on the ground and melted into the shadows of the alleyway behind a dumpster at the entrance. We'll have to do some scouting, but I think we can do it in team formation. The two legs won't be able to see us well. They've already spoiled the Phoebe night vision they naturally possess. If what we fear comes to pass, it won't matter anyway. The cryptids will be revealed and likely filmed on numerous devices. Seems a goodly portion of what shows up at these events are just there as voyeurs, thrill seekers and dilettantes with platforms to promote. He knew that much of what he'd said would not be translatable to the additional members of the pack. Yet he felt the need to reassure those who could comprehend that they would be able to traverse the ground as needed without drawing overwhelming attention. He looked to Lacy, who remained lead alpha. I'll take point just in case. The big dog woman nodded, one of the few human gestures, and they set off towards the gathering storm of human detritus. Director, apologies. It seems that the Genoas has destroyed our drone. We should send in another or simply wait the moment that it contacts the crowd. The pilot looked towards her immediate supervisor for direction. Assign the closest craft to observe the beast, and then lock onto and track it once it begins its attack. The fit man in the expensive clothing looked towards a row of figures near other types of monitors. Ensure that the jamming system is working properly. We don't want anyone getting any good shots of the cryptodes. For that matter, ensure a blackout so that no one will be able to call for official assistance without a landline. Close down the system as well and jam the radios of the first responders. We should have another mass of creatures arriving soon. No doubt the good doctor is angry and wishing to force the operators into action. He smirked. He knew that would not happen. The group that had manipulated so many for so long wanted the results of Dr. Z's experiments. They'd known him and known what he would be likely to do. They'd informed the director once he needed to know, and so he could guide the current operation. If anyone had forced any action, it was them, the true leaders, the eyes in the sky. Dr. Z snarled. The last one is gone. Our localized version of Operation Chaos is underway. he turned to face the last two Z-Techs, whose zombification was beginning to fade. They were elderly but fit, and their anger at the awakening of their minds and wills had them frothing. "Destroys the Keeper!" With that order, he walked from the room. He would take care of the remaining human crew members, the last of the witnesses. He heard the crashing of equipment and the grunts of physical combat fade behind him as he stalked down the hallway to the control room. It would have made sense to simply shoot the underlings, but he needed to exercise some of his fury to regain the sharper edges of his otherwise keen mind. The only way he knew to do that was to vent the rage. Without a word, he stalked into the room and knocked his first victim senseless. The others soon followed, and before long, the corpses were scattered around the room in pieces. Dr. Z panted from the exertion of shredding the physical forms. They had presented no tangible threat to him, but the tendons, ligaments, and muscle tissue that held them together gave way only with difficulty. Unthinkingly, he licked the blood of his victim from his hands. A small part of him was horrified for a moment. Then the hunger lust drove him to feast. The elder werewolf remained in the shadows. He preferred to stalk his prey and stir feelings of fear and anxiety. It made the meat and blood taste richer. Yet the potential victims milled about in clutches of angry members who shouted and threw objects and lit blazes. He watched in alarm as several of them lit objects afire and tossed them at a building to create greater conflagrations. While he didn't care for fire, he enjoyed the silhouettes of potential meals that danced against the glare of dancing flames. The bright, wavering light illuminated a nice, fat target. Then a very large creature leapt into the light and dispersed the silhouettes in cascading sprays of flesh and gore. The Genosqua had arrived at the party. The two legs, whom the Genosqua failed to directly assault, scattered of their own accord to seek refuge in the darkness, and behind flimsy obstacles that could not stop the enraged gargantuan, the werewolf Gape grinned. A tender morsel had crouched behind a car. Yes, that was the word for it. It was parked near where he crouched. Old memories of his former life begrudgingly rose to what remained of his forebrain. He gave a sinister laugh at the pitiful example of what the prey beings used for personal transportation. It was light purple and tiny compared to anything he recalled. A youngish two-legs male peeked around the front bumper of the hybrid vehicle and watched in horror as the nightmare giant reveled in gleeful destruction, much as he had been doing moments earlier. Only this creature took it to extremes he had never dreamt possible. His shouting from behind a mask at locals who were unlikely to even understand his casus bellum registered as mild annoyance in comparison to this embodiment of rage. His awe transformed to terror as he felt himself lifted and pressed into the maw of the monster he never noticed. Other eyes witnessed the major tableau and missed the minor tragedy that occurred in the deeper shadows. Young Pete and his mother had united and been joined by an old dogman, their father and mate, old Pete. They'd witnessed the slaughter of other cryptids, to include the deaths of their daughter and sister and her mate by the Genosqua. The remaining members of Pete's pack were furious, more than at the loss of their alpha could account for. The zombie venom had mostly faded, but the hateful state it had induced had been enhanced within these normal, reasonable specimens. The elder dogman had not been injected with venom until shortly before they were deliberately released. He had the substance in his system still, and simply followed the lead of the other two. He had not been subject to the hypnosis treatment, so his efforts had been unreliable thus far. They did not know what vulnerabilities the monster before them possessed, yet wanted to attack anyway. The madness of mindless anger had infected the two legs now. That had infected the two legs had now incited the normal, sensible beings to a state that required blood and destruction to satisfy the urges. "Rotten zombos," Carlos Phosphorus spat as he gazed upon the now unmoving Z-Tex. Dr. Z had ultimately betrayed him, even as he himself had betrayed Narcissa. "I'll get that crazy summabitch." He realized first he would have to attend to his wounds. One of the elderly men had struck him with a piece of metal pipe. It had mostly struck his now bruised shoulder, but had partially impacted his forehead and had left a pressure cut over a nasty bruise. The other zombies had seized him around the waist and had bitten him in his ample belly. There were several deep lacerations from the gnawing that ensued after the creature first sucked its teeth into his flesh. It had been exceptionally painful. In all his years working around animals and cryptids, he'd always managed to avoid any full-on bites until that moment. After he dressed his wounds, he would need to locate an effective weapon before he took on the enhanced old doctor. Elderly or not, Dr. Ignat Zolovok had grown physically imposing and fit. Dangerous rather than merely a figure that emanated a menacing presence. His knife had done for the Z-Tex. They weren't skilled assassins, and a few had kicked and punches had gotten them away from his person and in possession for proper slaughter. He would have liked to take more time with the process, since he loathed the things, but he had bigger fish to fry. He retrieved a tranq gun from the weapons locker, and an evil grin spread across his features. "I'll knock out the old codger. Then I can either feed him to any monster that return, or better yet, I can take my time with him and use what nature has taught me. Great way to wrap up this gig. Doubt he'll give me my last paycheck anyway." Definitely no reference. He giggled in a manner that would have been disturbing to anyone who heard it, like a hyena calling to its mate that dinner was served. Once the pack entered the warehouse, Lacy took over point from Earl. It was a simple matter of abilities. His nose was once more pitiful when compared to her magnificent snout. Earl stepped aside and allowed Earl 2 to slip into the back-up role that Oscar had previously taken for himself. Earl backed Adele in Earl 2's place, sparring a moment for pride in seeing the young beings taking on their graduated roles without prompting. Val pulled rear guard with Peppy in pew, the skunk ape in trail position. The Squatches fanned out to either flank as Overwatch and Reserve Response Forces. The design of the warehouse differed significantly from the old lab. It sprawled rather than remaining compact by dividing into levels. There was a clear delineation between the front office and the interior storage spaces. The control room was situated behind the office area. The doorway opened onto two passages, one that was short and ended at the control room door, and another that turned through some offices and led to the storage area. The door to the control room was open slightly, and Lacy paused and halted the rest of the team. She crept forward, ears swiveled towards the door, snout raised and questing. She listened for several moments, and then signaled the others to prepare to attack. Inside, the slurping, munching, and groveling sounds of a carnivore devouring its prey ceased. Lacy caught sight of the dining figure and noticed that his smell was familiar but altered. He was still a two-leg, but not dissimilar to her father's newest form. She noted that he detected their presence. He grinned, flashing crimson-stained teeth and fangs. His eyes glittered and his voice rasped from deep in his chest. "Welcome. I see that you all have returned to join in the fun. I saved some dainty organ meat for anyone who'd like to share supper with me." The pack members all halted, each startled by the matter-of-fact manner of the big cannibal. Before anyone could react, the beast man slammed shut the control room door. Electronic bars snicked into place. The reflective window in the door showed nothing but the momentary stunned faces of Lacy's pack. Whether Dr. Z was hiding in place or making his way to an escape hatch, no one knew. He could simply be readying another ambush. "Step aside, you. I have a key card." The keeper stood framed in the corner of the first turn in the hallway that led back to the cages. He held the tranquilizer rifle so that he covered Lacy and Earl too. Adele growled and her hackles rose. Earl tensed, his long side pistol at the ready with high-grain, hollow-point ammunition designed to ensure permanent rest. "Stop!" Lacy barked out her command. She spared a glance at Adele, who had been preparing to spring, and Earl, whose fingers had crept from the index position towards the trigger. She stared hard at the keeper, then motioned for him to come forward. She'd be happy to put him at risk. She and the others stepped aside and arranged themselves in preparation for a trap or an ambuscade. Carlos lowered the muzzle of his rifle and slowly stepped towards the control room. "He ordered the last Z-Tix to kill me. I want him dead too. Not sure what weapons he may have or if he's had an escape hatch. I'd been too busy to thoroughly explore the premise." He scanned his card and the locking bolts slammed back into their open position. He pushed the door all the way open and raised his rifle even as he scrambled backwards. The door swung inward until it was blocked by the dismembered lower portion of a human leg. The room was deserted, but a cool breeze flowed through a portal in the outer wall and through the doorway into the office area hallways. Dr. Z's new scent wafted strongly through the opening. Lacy signaled the pack to go back through the front entrance. She would not make the same mistake that had gotten Oscar killed by chasing the mad doctor directly. Earl called to her. "Adele and I will stay here with this one." She glanced over her shoulder but kept going. As the last member disappeared through the rolled-up gate, a thwomp of the air rifle sounded, and Adele gave a small yelp. She immediately tore out the projectile, even as the keeper swung over to fire at Earl. He didn't get the chance. Earl's pistol thundered and valves cracked. She'd stayed behind with her mate, knowing she could not keep pace with the larger, more feral cryptid members of the pack. Earl's .45 caliber shattered Carlos's hand that held the forestock of the rifle. Val's 9mm struck the rifle itself and destroyed the area just in front of the chamber. Before he could get his mouth open all the way for a good scream of pain and outrage, Adele picked up the keeper and flung him down the hallway. He landed and skidded, leaving behind a streaked trail of gore from his ruined hand. Earl looked to Val. "Thank you, my love. I forgot that you, too, were a captive. Things happen pretty fast. If you don't mind, we'll leave the keeper in Adele's care and go back up Lacy on her hunt for the head turd." He looked to his granddaughter. "You got this, sweetness?" Adele, lingering for a moment, then winked, her favorite two-leg expression that her grandfather had taught her. She had been ready for this since her days as a captive, when this fat lump of a man had bestowed misery on her and the other prisoners like wicked little presents. She fetched the air rifle and assured it was destroyed. Earl and Val stayed until Carlos Phosphorus was denuded of any potential weapons, or indeed clothing. Adele laughed at his piteous wails, the bargaining, the impotent threats. Stephanie lost control of her gorge, and her vegan supper spilled onto the curb and splashed onto the front wheel of the little e-car behind which she'd sheltered. The giant had spotted her. She knew that she was about to die. She couldn't believe that she'd let her friends talk her into rioting tonight. She could have gone to a party at Khalil's and Kareem's place instead. Her friends had left her behind when the monster had sprung into the midst of the crowd. There were bodies lying about, broken, mostly still. A few jerked in the final spasms of their death throes. Several had been left injured and screaming, but the enormous figure had delightfully crushed their skulls for them. Now it was coming for her. "It's not fair," she wailed. "We're supposed to be getting, justice tonight." Her vision blurred with welling tears, and she awaited the instant death that the Genesqua had dealt so fiercely, mere meters from her horrified features. She felt the air and ground tremble with the impact of its landing, and the motion of the vehicle as it was tossed aside like a dead AAA battery. Yet before the spade-like talon paw swept her into oblivion, a figure crashed into the back of the thing's knees, and a split second later, another crashed into its chest. It fell over backwards, and once again the ground trembled with the weight of its impact. A third figure, with a long, open snout, tore at the Genesqua's face and neck. The bellows that emerged from its cavernous breast rang through the night, and pushed aside the lesser noises that had come before it. There was still anger now, but it was mingled with surprise, outrage, and for the first time in its existence, a tinge of fear. Old Pete's altered state of mind led him to attack the head instead of the arms, as was the normal procedure with their pack. He had inadvertently discovered the vulnerability of the monster that had murdered his daughter and her mate. Yet the creature still contained plenty of life, and therefore plenty of fight. It used its arms to great effect in slamming old Pete's mate in the face, and then striking old Pete on the side of his torso. He felt his ribs crack, and despite his desperation, he had to surrender his hold. Young Pete had extracted himself from under the legs of the beast, and now worked his way up to the other arms of the creature. His mother tore ineffectively at the giant's midsection. When he saw his father batted aside, he registered that the only blood the monster had shed was from his face and neck. Before he could tear into the new target, he felt himself flying through the air. He hadn't caused any damage to the arm, and the incredibly hard and strong appendage had been levered with a twist of the mighty trunk. Young Pete found himself stunned and resting at an odd angle against the wall of a burning building. He watched as the creature used both hands to pound his mother's head into a mass of blood, flesh, and bone. He heard his father scream and saw his leap towards the Genesqua's hideous features. Now, however, the arms and hand were free. They caught old Pete in mid-leap, and the fangs of the larger cryptid sank into the dogman's throat and twisted savagely. Earl and Val met the rest of the pack near the front entrance. Dr. Z had once again taken a motor vehicle. They knew the direction, towards the riots, but they didn't comprehend its specific destination or goals upon reaching it. Earl offered a suggestion. "We should do damage control. Get the cryptids wrangled to prevent more infections." Lacy and the others agreed, and they set out in Dr. Z's wake towards the sounds and smell of devastation, carnage and ruin, maybe a knock, a little sense into a few two-legs along the way. He grinned at Val, who offered an equally feral grimace of her own. They indeed encountered violent-minded two-legs before they found any of the rampaging cryptids. Around 20 of them smashed and rocked an SUV marked police. As the pack approached, the mob managed to roll the vehicle onto its side. Their triumphant cheers were cut short when several of them spotted Lacy looming up out of the dark, flanked by her young but full-grown pups. The two-legs could only see silhouettes of the squatches. They employed a form of natural camouflage, and these two were masters at clinging to the shadows and dark spaces created by the light of deliberately inflamed structures and vehicles. One of those who froze in shock held a Molotov cocktail, which he intended to splash onto the police unit. His jaw, habitually hung at a gape, now hidden by the plague mask and covered by a hoodie, managed to drop open even further. He forgot what he was holding, but the flame crept towards the fuel source, and before anyone could manage a reaction to the new arrivals, the burning concoction exploded. Glass shredded his hand and the features of two of his erstwhile lackeys. Despite the pain of the cuts, it was the fire that now spread up his arms and onto his clothing that caused him to scream. A portion of the petroleum had splashed onto his face mask. He was soon engulfed, and shortly thereafter lost his ability to make any noise beyond a few squeaks and a sizzle. Oh, there was no one left to help him. The rest of the crowd had literally split. A few beat at flames, but most simply sprinted in what their instincts told them was the safest direction: away. The keeper was in tremendous pain. He watched as the large, feral dog woman stalked gracefully in his direction. He knew it was the female they'd zombified. His experience had taught him how to distinguish between individual monsters. Despite the overwhelming pain from the gunshot and the bruises from having been struck by revolting Z-Techs and flung down a corridor, he managed to choke out some words, a final plea for mercy from this being he had so dreadfully wronged. It wasn't my fault. It was my job. If I didn't do it, Dr. Z would have tortured me and my family. Adele gaped in her best sinister dogwoman manner. Uncle Earl had told her that when humans were in extremis, they tend to tell the truth in their tone and body language, even when their words were lies. If this one had a family, a pack, it would have specified whether it included a wife, a mate, pups, children. By now he would have scrambled to produce names, desperately trying to save them. Instead, this one thought only for himself. Besides, she had observed the pleasure he took in causing discomfort, or even pain, in others. She knew what he was without truly understanding how such a repulsive creature could develop. She grinned even wider when the ammonia stunk of urine issued from the newly formed puddle near the thing's naked and shriveling groin. He babbled on, trying alternately to bargain and to threaten, all to no avail. Adele loomed close to him, aware that he no longer possessed the means to physically harm her. She knew what she wanted, what he deserved. He should suffer as he had made so many others suffer with his activities. Agony should be his lot. Yet she knew that she should catch up with the pack. It was not the way of her kind to set aside responsibilities for mere pleasure. She felt no compunctions about torture. That was part of nature. Then she thought of the best way to inflict lasting misery on this monstrosity. She leaned forward and bit into his face. She could have easily crushed his skull, but she held back. Instead, she reveled for a brief moment in the creature's absolute terror. Then she let go and left the stunned, unconscious figure lying in its own mess. It would take a few days, but he would become one of the creatures like those he'd taken such pleasure in harming. She chuckled as she ran to catch up to her own. Young Pete managed to get himself upright and to howl as the Genesqua slaughtered his father. He was still unsteady on his feet and had no idea how he was going to attack or even flee. Yet even as he and his pack had saved the feckless Stephanie, a new threat to the stone-skinned man arrived, the arch enemies of its kind, the Gugwe, the face-eaters. The action quickly resolved into a blur as two of the smaller beings leapt upon and attacked the larger one in turn, and worked in unison to distract and to build up to a final confrontation. These cryptids were natural enemies from ancient times. It was brute force matched against speed and concerted timing of assault. Young Pete noticed that the two-legged female had curled into a fetal ball and made some annoying whining noises. He scooped her up and carried her around the corner of the building that was now burning in earnest. The walls of the distant sirens pierced his hearing, and he knew he had to escape the noises before they overwhelmed his senses. He needed a forest or even an open field at this point, anything but the hard surface beneath his feet. He realized that he had carried the small figure far past the engulfing structure and to an area that was relatively safe. Two other two legs ran towards them, so he dropped her unceremoniously and stalked forward. Most of the two legs changed their direction and ran towards the nearest openings between structures. Some ran past him on either side. None tried to confront him or to succor the hapless little female. He was shocked to see a set of cryptids, led by a dog woman, Alpha, following in the wake of the fleeing herd of two-legged locusts. She was flanked by a young dogman and the most stunningly beautiful being he had ever seen. The big black cat padded through the inky blackness of the alleyways. It was easier than she would have assumed to avoid the two legs. She reached the edge of the destruction, and with fewer fires and more power failures, the shadows now encroached from numerous angles. Occasionally she caught the scent of fear from the den of the two legs. Some huddled around small light sources within and whispered of the dread that reigned so nearby. These homes were not in the most prosperous of neighborhoods, yet they belonged mostly to middle-income families who wished to live near the convenience of the city but still maintain single-family homes. To pillaging gang members, they presented excellent targets, especially since the larger riots and arson activities had been broken up by unknown forces. The cat noted the group of creeping two-legs that reeked of smoke and other unnatural stenches. They fanned out and selected their prey. She easily avoided most, but she turned a corner after she watched a group slither past her hiding place. Apparently, the cluster had split from another, larger assembly of criminality. She continued to stalk silently past, and had nearly made it when one of the group members shouted hysterically. She bolted into the next pool of darkness, but it was too late. A loud crack and a flash of light that repeated in a staccato punishment of her ears pursued, and she felt a hot, stinging pain in one of her rear legs. She spun and leaped without thinking, instinctively attacking her tormentor. Zack had fired every round he had at the monster cat. The night was not going as planned, as he had seen things earlier. Monsters had led him to flee along with his friends. He had brought the pistol along in case they encountered resistance or counter-protesters or a lone first responder. He had it in hand, in preparation to take on anyone foolish enough to try to defend their property or stop attackers. Then the monster startled him, and he emptied the magazine. Didn't scare me, just jumped out so sudden. He assured his bruised ego, or would have, had over 200 pounds of feline complied with claws and fangs, not slammed into him at that moment. The great beast crushed his body to the ground, even as it rent his head from his shoulders, except for a few wet threads of flesh. He never felt the crushing weight as the cat used his chest and creeping ribs as a springboard to launch herself towards her next victim. His head lay on the ground near the back door of the house they'd been about to invade. His brain registered the sound of his friends being sliced, batted, and crunched to ribbons, and the shrieks of triumph from the great throat of the jet-fured juggernaut. Director, the Genisqua is down. The two Gugwe attacked it. One of them is now red mashed potatoes. The other is limping eastward. The big G is neutralized with a shattered skull. The trim man smiled. Well, so much for the most destructive power available. Guess the Dogman pack did enough damage to allow a mere pair of Gugwai to take down their nemesis. Any eyes and ears on my friendly pack? The lead tech nodded. Yes, sir. The last of the feral Dogman pack has encountered them. So far, it looks collegial. She paused. Another cryptid is incoming. The BBC, or the big black cat. So quoth this raven. And we do have one more part to this chapter. I hope you enjoy it as much as I do, my darlings, and thank you to Michael for his contributions, his wonderful stories that he shares with us. Thank you so kindly for stopping by my chateau, my darlings. It does mean so much to me. Please, if you have not subscribed, as many of you have not, please do so. Give me a like so I know what you would like to hear, and comment. I always love to read your comments. And special thanks to my Patreon and membership supporters. Ciao, darlings.